general and the special senses. For the general senses, the receptor structure is simple. It's very simple. The first order neuron is the receptor. In the special senses, it's a very complex setup. Okay, we have a special receptor cell that communicates to the first order neuron. And that's just the way that it is, okay? I'm going to abbreviate neuron as little n. That's I have a bunch of shorthand that I use, so when I was a student I could keep up with what the instructor was saying instead of writing out every word. But that's my usual abbreviation for neuron. So even though I need this space, I'm going to write on it really quickly. So look, in the general senses, my first order neuron out in the periphery is the receptor cell. There might be some special modifications near the end of it, as we'll see later, but for the most part, this cell is the receptor. In the special senses, let's say in the sense of smell, I'm going to have a receptor cell that's going to go synapse on the first order neuron, which will then talk to the second order neuron, and so on and so forth. So we have an extra cell out in the periphery in the special senses. So it's a more complex setup, and the reason it's there is it allows for a more complex signaling pathway. We won't have time to get in all of that detail. You know, I'm a neurobiologist by training, and we did a ton of this stuff, but not all of it is going to be super important for you guys, okay? At least at this level. So that's one of the main differences between the general and special senses. General senses have simple receptors. It's just the first order neuron. Special senses have a complex arrangement where there's an extra receptor cell that has to communicate, release neurotransmitter onto the first order neuron. For receptor distribution, this is very generalized on the surfaces of the body. So, if I have a touch receptor in the tip of my finger that does fine touch, I have them all over the hand, all over the arm, all over my entire body. I have some fine touch receptors. I have thermoreceptors that can detect heat on the tip of my nose, the tip of my finger, the tip of my toes, or the tip of the tongue. And even on the internal surfaces very often, like if you drink something hot and you can feel it in your stomach. So these are all over the surfaces of the body. All those modalities that we listed, pain, temperature, touch, vibration, they're located all over the surface of the body. The special senses are located in special sensory organs. For example, we only find photoreceptors for vision in the retina of the eye. The retina is considered an organ, so to speak, as the eyeball is, or it's a layer of tissue in the eyeball. And that is a special sensory organ only for vision for photoreceptors. We don't find them anywhere else. Auditory receptors are found in a structure inside the inner ear called the cochlea. We don't find them anywhere else. So these always have a very special location where we find the specific receptors, and they're not found anywhere else. Gustatory receptors on the tongue, olfactory receptors in the nose, and so on. Central processing. These are usually processed in what we call the primary. That's our abbreviation for primary, a 1 with a little odd. Sensory cortex, which would be the postcentral gyrus, if you remember that from part 1A and P. Okay, so almost every general sensation will go to the postcentral gyrus on either side of the brain. Of course, you should remember the right side of our body is monitored by the left side of the brain and vice versa. The special senses are located or processed in specialized cortical regions, I should say. There's special areas, I can't say the word special today. There's special areas or regions of the cortex, the cerebral cortex. For example, if we were to look at a brain, and you should know this from part 1, vision is done in the occipital lobe at the back. Olfaction and gustation are done in the temporal lobe, or areas close to the temporal lobe. And hearing is done in different locations of the brain, but every area of the brain has its own special cortical region that processes, at least initially, okay? So these all go to the same location, Each one of these has a special area that it communicates to. Finally, the receptive field. These are usually relatively large, not huge, but larger, and these are very small. In very many instances, the receptive field for the special senses is so small that you actually have to hit the neuron in order for it to fire. Where in the general senses, sometimes there's some specialized tissue, some connective tissue or a modified Schwann cell wrapped around the end of the receptor so that if something bumps that, it still messes with the receptor. Kind of like if I put a big sumo wrestling suit on you and I try to punch you, even though I don't touch your skin, because of that big wrapping around you, something hits it, you still feel it. So these usually have a large receptive field with some specialized tissue, although not always. These have very small receptive fields. You almost always hit the receptor cell for it to fire. All right, so listen, there's a lot of information on this page, and we've covered quite a bit. I'm gonna try to wrap this up. I'm gonna try to finish a little bit of page 6, and then we're gonna start another video where we're gonna talk about the actual receptors themselves. So, I can tell you this for a fact, as a neurobiologist that studied this stuff in great detail, our understanding of sensory receptors, some of them is pretty good, some of them not so much. We're still trying to figure them out. It's very complex how our brain interprets information and how we process this information. So if you look at the top of page 6, it talks about the interpretation of sensory information. Now, when we go from the periphery to the cerebral cortex, and even if you look at the primary sensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus, even that is mapped out. So let me give you an example, okay? So if I'm looking at one side of the brain here, and I have the central sulcus, and I have the postcentral gyrus right behind it. If I look along the postcentral gyrus, almost every part of the body, well, every part of the body really, the neurons can go to a specific area of the postcentral gyrus. We would have the precentral gyrus here, okay? And when we look at the postcentral gyrus, it's actually very highly mapped out. For example, deep inside the fold, close to the longitudinal fissure, we would have the genitals. I'm just going to put male genitals because they're easier to draw, okay? And then we would have the big toe and the sole of the foot, and then the ankle, the lower leg, the buttocks, the torso, the shoulder, arm, your hand, thumb gets a huge area, the face, the lips actually get a very large surface area. And there's a huge area that monitors the lips and our face. All of this is mapped out along here, okay? So, somewhere along the postcentral gyrus, let me redraw this one, but I'm not going to color it in, okay? All along this postcentral gyrus is this little person. This little person, by the way, is called a homunculus. The ulus or unculus usually means little, and homo means man. It's a little man or little person mapped out all along the postcentral gyrus. So if somebody poked a finger, then the neuron from that finger is going to go from wherever we poke into the spinal cord. The first order neuron will fire on the second order neuron. That will go up to the thalamus, and that's going to go up to somewhere here, to this area. Let's say it would be right here along the postcentral gyrus. So the pathway from the receptor cell in the periphery all the way up to the cerebral cortex is called a labeled line. That labeled line is going to tell us the location and the type of stimulus. Somebody poked you with a needle, so it's a nociceptor, and you know that it happened all the way out here on the specific finger based upon where it fires in the brain. If I were to go and tickle another part of the body, let's say your foot is down here, your big toe, and someone tickles the bottom of your foot with a feather or something, then these neurons are going to go into the spinal cord. It's going to go up to your brain, to your thalamus, and then it's going to go to another area of the postcentral gyrus, but it'll fire much deeper, and it'll fire maybe way up here where the foot is located. So that labeled line is simply a connection between the receptor in the periphery and the part of the cerebral cortex, the neurons in the cerebral cortex that interpret that information. It's almost this way. If you ever look behind your TV or DVD players or whatever things are hooked up and you got a million plugs and you can't figure out which one to unplug to get the TV to move, you got to unplug everything and check it. It's a mess. You don't know which plug is connected to which. If you go and you tag them with a piece of tape and write TV, DVD player, I don't know, Xbox 360, whatever games kids play, I don't know what they're all called. So now you know which plug goes to which location. Every line has been labeled so that we know this cable goes from here to there. Now our brain will only interpret the type of stimulus and the location of the stimulus based upon the labeled line. If I cut a labeled line, if you damage a nerve or cut it, then I've cut communication in my brain. I can't detect that stimulus. Oddly enough, though, what's really unique is, what if I could somehow take this blue neuron and rewire it to synapse on this neuron here? Literally changing where I communicate to, and I have both this neuron and this neuron communicate to the exact same neuron, say up here in the thalamus. Well, I would possibly interpret the interpretation. Even if I tickled my foot, I would feel like you're also tickling my finger. We can actually get some cross wiring here, and sometimes that happens in what we call referred pain. We're going to talk about referred pain in a little bit, but essentially referred pain is pain that's interpreted as coming from one part of the body, but the stimulus is in another location. The very most common one is when people are having a heart attack. The pain in the heart is going to travel through the same nerve that has a branch that goes down part of your arm. So a lot of times when people are having a heart attack, they feel pain radiating down their left arm. It's one of the symptoms and signs that you look for. There's nothing wrong with the arm. The pain is also being referred over there. Like when a doctor refers you to someone else, to another location. And in some very weird instances in amputations, people can get some cross wiring, and there's some interesting cases where if you tickle a person's face, they feel the hand that's been amputated, because sometimes the neurons that were located here will cross wire to the neurons that are communicating here. They're looking for connections, and our body can sometimes cross wire itself. And so our body will interpret the location of the stimulus based upon the labeled line on it arrives. If it arrives here, my brain thinks it came from there, even if I cross-wired this neuron and actually tickled the foot. Anyway, that's an interesting aside. I'm sorry to get sidetracked, but this stuff gets really interesting. We just don't have time to go into all the different detail. Now, what about the intensity? What about the duration? How long does it last? So the intensity and the duration of the stimulus. The labeled line tells us the location and the type of stimulus, but what we call sensory coding tells us about the intensity, the duration, if there's any direction of movement of the stimulus. Sensory coding is actually similar to what they used to call Morse code. I don't know how many of y'all know what this is anymore. These days with cell phones, kids don't even know what payphones are if they see one somewhere. But in Morse code, this guy Samuel Morse figured out that if I take this device that's hooked up to a wire, if I touch this thing and complete the circuit so that when I touch this metal to this metal, the electricity will flow here, at the end I can get a beep. And they would sit there and tap things out. Morse code is the series of dots and dashes that make out letters of the alphabet, and you can send a signal. Deet, 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 deet. People would read the dots and dashes. They would be trained in Morse code, this code of dots and dashes, and be able to write out letters. This is back in the 1800s, okay? Well, that's how sensory coding kind of works. The series of dots and dashes. So the stimulus, when I interpret something at the end, I can tell if the signal is coming, say, from San Francisco through the wires across the nation, or if it was coming from, let's say, I don't know, Colorado. So if I have another line firing, and they're all going to the same location, this guy at the end can tell me, did it arrive on this labeled line? Is this message coming from San Francisco, or is it coming from Colorado? Now, if this guy's firing a certain firing pattern, then someone at this end over here is going to take that series of dots and dashes and interpret it. Like SOS is the famous signals, dot, 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 dash, dash, dash is the letter O, and dot, dot, dot is the letter S. If someone else did this, oops, my bad, let me change that. Then someone would interpret that as OSS, the Office of Special Services, or the British Special Agents or something. I forget what it was called in World War II. But nonetheless, the labeled line tells us where the stimulus is coming from. The firing pattern, called sensory coding at the neuron in the cortex, tells us more information. How intense is it? Is it just a very light tickle? Is it a long tickle? Is someone really tickling you really hard? Sorry, I dropped a marker. Sorry about that. So the sensory coding is the firing pattern in the cerebral cortex that tells us information about the intensity and the duration and sort of the length of the stimulus very often. Okay, so you need to read the stuff that's in bold in the note set on this page. You need to understand the difference between the labeled line and what sensory coding is telling us. All right. So now, the last three things I want to cover before I move on. Sorry, this is starting to drag on a little bit, and I realize that, but hey, we got to do what we got to do. We are going to talk about the different types of receptors as far as how the receptors are going to fire. There are two different types of receptors. One receptor is called a tonic receptor, and another type is called a phasic receptor. So when it comes to all the different modalities that we were talking about, some of those types of receptors are going to be phasic or they're going to be tonic. I'm going to talk about phasic receptors first. When we talk about phasic receptors, we usually say that they have an on phase. And by that, what we mean is they are releasing neurotransmitter. They're firing action potentials. NT is going to be my abbreviation for the word neurotransmitter, the chemical released by a neuron onto another cell. Or they have what's called the off phase. They are not releasing neurotransmitter. Okay? So, this is how we learn how most neurons work. I have a neuron, a receptor here, that's going to go and eventually fire in the spinal cord on another neuron. If there's nothing messing with this first order neuron, very often it's silent. It's not releasing neurotransmitter. It's in the off phase. If something stimulates it and it starts releasing neurotransmitter here, it's switched to on. When the stimulus goes away, it switches off. So there's an on phase or an off phase. Phasic receptors are like an old school light switch. The light is either on or it's off, and there's no in between. Okay. Now I'm going to erase this, and I'm going to talk about tonic receptors. Tonic receptors are a little bit more interesting. And I'm not going to make you memorize which ones are phasic or which ones are tonic. You guys can read and understand that stuff at some point in your near future on your own. So when you're reading the chapter, if you come across something that says this type of pain receptor is a phasic receptor, you know it's usually off unless something stimulates it. When you read about, let's say a photoreceptor is a tonic receptor, then you're going to know what that means, okay? So, for tonic receptors, we say that these are always said to be on or releasing neurotransmitter. There's a constant flow of communication. In this setup, a receptor cell will always be releasing a certain quanta or volume of neurotransmitter on the next neuron, communicating to it. They can increase or decrease neurotransmitter release. Okay? So it allows for a more complex signaling pathway. In phasic receptors, if nothing happens, we're completely unaware. But if something happens, we know only one thing happened. If I poke you, you feel pain, and that's it. Now, for tonic receptors, they allow us to respond to different stimuli in different ways. So, for example, if in the sense of smell, or let's talk about taste. taste is a better example. On your tongue, certain molecules binding to your tongue can cause certain receptors to increase neurotransmitter release, start firing like crazy, which will tell this neuron one message, and it'll continue to fire even more than before. And in some instances, a different molecule that you taste on the same receptor cell can cause this receptor cell to start to decrease its neurotransmitter release and sometimes completely shut off, and then this neuron gets a totally different signal. So tonic receptors allow us to tell or allow us to communicate different types of information from the same receptor cell. Very often they can respond to two different chemicals. One will cause it to depolarize and fire more action potentials, release more neurotransmitter. A different stimulus will cause it to fire less neurotransmitter. And therefore we have different types of stimuli that one receptor can respond to. Where in phasic receptors, it's one stimulus. It either fires or it doesn't. There's no variation in communication, okay? Now, a couple of more definitions and then we'll wrap this video up. I know it's getting long, but hey, I have that problem, so get used to it. I could do this stuff in 5 minutes with a bunch of PowerPoints, but I don't believe that lends to your real understanding, so I take my time and try to explain things. I hope that helps you. If you don't like it, drop my class and take someone else. Adaptation. Well, when we adapt to things, that means we get used to it. We kind of accommodate to whatever the changes in that area are. So an adaptation is, in the world of sensory physiology, is defined as a decrease in sensitivity to a stimulus due to a constant stimulus. So let's say you sit down next to someone at lunch and they say, hey, hi, how are you doing? You start listening. Oh, I'm fine, and you? And you start having a conversation. If this person can talk for 10 minutes straight without taking a breath about nothing that's important, you start to tune them out. You quit listening. Then they ask you a question. Did you hear what I said? Huh? What? So that's adaptation. We sort of can filter out information. Those sensory receptors, if constantly exposed to a stimulus, and that stimulus is not going to alter our ability to survive or reproduce, which are the two primary goals of all animals. To survive as an individual, it means find food and avoid becoming food, or survive as a species, which means find a mate and mate as often as possible. So if you receive some information, you detect a smell, you might look for what's causing that smell. If the smell sticks around for long enough, eventually you quit smelling that aroma. Like when you put cologne on, you smell it at first. But then after a while, you can't smell it. Everyone else can, so don't put any more on. But some people keep putting it on every 10 minutes and flies can't even survive around them. But anyway, so that's adaptation, our decreased sensitivity to a stimulus if the stimulus is constantly around. And there's two types of adaptation that we can talk about. One is called peripheral adaptation. In peripheral adaptation, what occurs is the decrease in sensitivity, occurs at the receptor cell, which is out in the periphery. So think about this again. Here's your CNS. Here's your spinal cord, right? Your brain and spinal cord. Here's the thalamus. The receptor, in the general senses, would be this first order neuron. If I stimulate it and I keep getting the information going up to the brain, I haven't adapted yet. But if you keep tickling the same spot, like when you put your jeans on in the morning, you feel them, but then after a while you're becoming aware of your clothes. Your touch receptors adapt to that constant stimulus. So that would be peripheral adaptation if the sensory receptor cell out on the periphery gets used to it. The same thing can happen in the sense of smell. Our receptors, if you're smelling, I don't know, verbena, lime, coconut, mocha, or whatever, that's going to send a signal into your brain through a series of neurons. If you continue to smell that, this neuron will stop smelling that particular sensation. But in the olfactory pathway, the receptor cell doesn't stop responding. It's one of the nuclei along the pathway out into our brain one of the centrally located nuclei is where these cells say, okay, we've been getting that message, we're going to quit responding to it. And in that case, we call that central adaptation. In central adaptation, sorry, I'm not writing very well right now. I realize this video is getting kind of long. I'm trying to be conscious of that, but we have a lot of material to cover. So I start rushing a little bit. In central adaptation, the decrease in sensitivity occurs at a sensory nucleus along the pathway, or at a nucleus along the sensory pathway. Some books will say it one way, some will say the other. So essentially, the name tells you where the adaptation is occurring. Is it occurring at the receptor in the periphery? Or is it occurring at a centrally located nucleus along the sensory pathway? The receptor is still firing, but one of the cells receiving the information halfway through the pathway says, not that smell anymore. What that allows is, though, if I continue to stimulate this neuron will shut down. In peripheral adaptation, we can shut down the sensation for a while, for extended periods. One of the examples for those of you that do physical therapy assistant and occupational therapy assistant, if someone has surgery, you'll see this a lot with people that have carpal tunnel releases. The scar on the hand can be very sensitive if you cut some of the sensory neurons. And they'll have what's called hyperalgesia, super sensitivity to pain. If they touch that scar, man, they just can't stand it. Other carpal tunnel patients, no problems, but some people become super sensitive. Well, one of the things that gets prescribed for OTAs and PTAs is called desensitization therapy, where they'll have you constantly rub it as long as you can stand, and the more that you do that, eventually the receptor cells will get used to the stimulus, and then they no longer respond to the pain. The sensitivity goes away. Problem is, if you stick a needle in that receptor now, it's not going to respond. It's shut off, at least for a period of time. Where in central adaptation, I can filter out one aroma. But if a new aroma comes along, let's say you go to Bath & Body Works and you're smelling coconut, lime, verbena, mocha, melon or something. And then all of a sudden you smell pearberry or vanilla mist, Sierra, something, I don't know. This sensation, when it arrives, because of also the tonic receptors, one receptor cell can respond to a different stimulation, different sensation, or different stimulus, I should say, and alter its firing pattern. And then at this nucleus, we let the new sensation through. So you can filter out old smells, but let new ones through because of the way that central adaptation works. The receptor is not shut off. It's responding to different stimuli. The old stimuli can be filtered out at the sensory nucleus, but the new one will be allowed through because of the change in firing pattern. So anyway, finally, well, listen, that's going to cover everything that I wanted to talk to up to this point. We're going to pick up with the general sensory receptors, the different modalities, and we're going to talk about each one in some detail in the next video. So this was the first video in the series. We're going to move on to video 2 on the general senses. And these will all be listed on my page on Canvas, so hopefully you guys can just follow along and do the lectures in the correct order. All right? That's if you're in my class. If you're not in my class, I hope this made some sense to you. I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I'll see you on the flip side in the next video. All right? Thanks for watching.